Hello, this is the Lord's Legion and welcome to a brand new countdown, and I use the term countdown very loosely in this video. As in this video I'm going to be focusing on the 10 movies that I personally like that everyone else hates. Now before I get into this list, I want to point out a few things. For one, none of these are my personal guilty pleasures, and none of them are movies that I hate myself for liking, as I do think that they do have some redeemable aspects. Second of all, this is in no particular order because let's face it, I really can't be bothered inputting them in a specific order for this video. And it really goes without saying, but this is just my personal opinion and chances are you probably hate all of these movies. And lastly, here's a quick shout out to Zilla Universe, as he was the one that suggested me this video. So without further ado, let's begin with this list. Now kicking off the list, we have The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Now this film is mostly hated for 3 reasons. 1, the fact that it pretty much killed the Spider-Man shared universe idea. 2, the fact that the pacing was all over the place, in which even I'll admit that that is a legit piece of criticism. And 3, well, just false advertisement really. But even with all that being said, I still think The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a really enjoyable movie. I mean, the cast all around were just magnificent, especially Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone. And plus the effects were really stellar, especially when it came down to the fight scenes. And hell, despite how Electro's motivations were a little too basic and silly, at the very least he was a somewhat fleshed out villain. Did the film suffer from too many villains? Of course. Was the pacing completely off? Absolutely. But despite all of its faults, I still think The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a really solid film on its own. And at the very least, there is clearly some heart in this movie. And it's leagues beyond Spider-Man 3. Next on the list is Chappie, and similarly with The Amazing Spider-Man 2, this film is clearly a mess. The overall concept was pretty interesting in that we do have an AI that's trying to adapt into this gritty world. But because Chappie has a mind of a baby, he doesn't know right and wrong. And so he is easily influenced by other gangsters. And admittedly, pretty much everything with the Chappie character was handled really well, and even the effects were good for him. Unfortunately, everything else falls flat, because the rest of the actors were either forgettable or completely bland, and plus most of the fight scenes weren't really that intriguing. But like I already mentioned, if it wasn't for Chappie being a really memorable character and how well they handled him in the entire film, then I would say give this one a pass. Next on my list, we have Jigsaw. Now yes, there is a huge gap between this one as well as the last chapter, but truth be told, I think that this is a really solid Saw film. If not the best one since maybe even Saw 3. The victims in this film were fairly memorable, and I really like the whole mystery on whether or not John Kramer is really still alive or not. But this film isn't without its flaws, and truth be told, the death traps in this movie are strangely too elaborate, and the ending makes very little sense. But let's be fair, the Saw series has a pretty hit and miss track record. And as far as Saw movies are concerned, especially for someone who is a pretty big fan of the Saw series, I would say that this is a pretty solid film. And I am pretty intrigued on where we're going to be heading next within this potential new trilogy. Up next we have Terminator Salvation, and honestly, at the very least this film tried to be new. Instead of sticking to the Terminator formula that was established in the trilogy, at the very least they tried to do something completely different and stick to the apocalyptic future. And it really goes without saying, it can't beat the first 2 Terminator films, but this one is leagues beyond Genesis and the 3rd film. With one clear exception of bad CGI, I honestly thought that it was fairly good for the most part. And I thought the action was done fairly well, all things considered. Nothing high art, and I wouldn't say that it's even a solid Terminator film, but at the very least this film tried to go in a completely different direction, even if it wasn't entirely successful. Next on the list we have the Halloween remake by Rob Zombie. Only the first one though, because the second one can go rot for all I care. Now like pretty much every horror franchise at this point, Halloween has a pretty hit and miss track record with each film. And although I wouldn't consider this to be a remotely good Halloween film per se, I still think that this is a pretty decent horror flick on its own. And at the very least this remake actually tried something new with Michael Myers by somewhat humanizing the character. Now me personally, I feel like it kinda defeats the purpose of Michael Myers being the human embodiment of evil. Given credit where credit is due, at the very least Rob Zombie still managed to make Michael Myers a threatening force of nature. And as far as horror remakes go, I wouldn't say that's necessarily it, but it's beyond the other terrible remakes such as Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Next on the list we have Underworld, and yes, I will admit that each and every sequel got worse and worse. I still thought that the original was still a fairly fun movie. Vampires on one side, the Lycans on the other, and a badass female lead in the middle. And then just have a battle royale. Now it might be just me in that I am a bit of a sucker when it comes down to the supernatural elements, as well as the gothic aesthetics. I still think that this is a fairly fun ride. I will admit that this film is nothing high art, but really it wasn't trying to be. All it wanted to be is just a silly action film featuring vampires and werewolves. And in that department, I think Underworld nails it in that regard. Up next we have Transformers: Dark of the Moon. Now this one is the only Transformers film that I actually like, and the main reason is, well, it's the closest thing to a good Transformers movie. Now yes, we do have all of the trademarks coming from Michael Bay, but that's only in the first 30 minutes. But when we finally get to that big climax, this is where this film truly shines, because for the first time the Decepticons finally do something that they were supposed to do in the first one. They try to invade Earth. And also, I thought that Sentinel Prime is the best main antagonist since Megatron. Hell, even the action scenes were done relatively well, because for once you can actually tell what's going on. And I also thought that the CG was at its best in this film in the entire series. Again, it's far from perfect, but as far as Transformers films go, this one really deserves another chance. Up next we have Ghost Rider: Spirit of Vengeance, and I will admit that this one is the closest in being a guilty pleasure film. For one, we have Nicolas Cage as, well, Nicolas Cage, but at least in this one it is somewhat justified because he does have a demon inside him. And speaking of demons, the actual Ghost Rider himself looks amazing, and whenever he's on screen it just looks so glorious, and even the action was pretty exciting. Now yes, even I can't deny that this movie is very flawed from pretty much all aspects, but given credit where it's due, at the very least this film is a much better representation of the Ghost Rider, at least in comparison to the first film. And as bizarre as this film really is, I honestly still had a lot of fun. Up next we have Mortal Kombat, and as far as video game adaptations are concerned, this one is probably the best live action one. Is this film incredibly cheesy? Yes. Is the violence incredibly neutered down? Yes. But despite all of its flaws, I still think that the Mortal Kombat movie is still a pretty good representation of the actual video games. Because unlike most video game adaptations, at the very least this is a very faithful adaptation. And plus the action scenes as well as the effects were really good for its time. And surprisingly, they haven't aged that bad. Of course, with a few exceptions, of course. Now you guys can go ahead and hate on Mortal Kombat Annihilation all you want, but in my mind I think this one is a really solid Mortal Kombat film on its own. But we can all agree on one thing: here's hoping that the reboot does a much better job. And last but certainly not least, we have Star Wars: The Last Jedi. Now yes, this one is more divisive than anything else, but seeing as how many fans really hate the movie, I'm going to put it on there anyway. Now the main reason why people seem to hate The Last Jedi so much is because the movie itself went in a completely different direction, and that's the exact reason why I love it so much. Does it have legitimate problems? Yeah, but honestly I think that they are very few and far between. And people seem to bash this film so much because none of their theories turned out to be true. And at the end of the day, Star Wars: The Last Jedi was the exact Star Wars movie that I've been waiting for, because of some real good character development as well as some really kick-ass moments, and just how bold this movie really is. So what movies do you personally like that everyone else seems to hate? Comment below and share some thoughts. And as always, thank you guys for watching this video. Please like and subscribe. Take care and have a good one.